This is BBC Radio 5 Live.
Hello and welcome to 5 Live Investigates. I'm Adrian Goldberg. Tonight, the kids taking powerful drugs they don't need. We hear from teachers who say youngsters are being diagnosed with ADHD and prescribed stimulants because of pressure from pushy parents. Some want their children diagnosed because it helps them claim benefits.
Some parents would exaggerate what exactly is happening at home, particularly in terms of aggressive behaviour, violent behaviour, breaking up furniture and so on, in order to get a care allowance, maybe a 24-hour care allowance.
This is 5 Live.
Hello, I'm Adrian Goldberg. Tonight on 5 Live Investigates, the school children being prescribed powerful drugs which their head teachers say they don't need. The youngsters concerned have been diagnosed with ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. But teachers have been telling us that in some cases the system is being abused by parents who push to have their children treated with drugs like Ritalin because it allows them to claim benefits. And there are concerns that doctors are too willing to hand out the meds before carrying out proper assessments. Our reporter Mukul Devachand has been investigating. We'll hear from him in a moment. But as always, we want your stories and comments. Are drugs like Ritalin too readily prescribed for naughty children? Or do more youngsters need these stimulants? Drop us a text to 85058 or email goldberg@bbc.co.uk. Alternatively, send a comment via our Facebook or Twitter accounts. And Mukul, good evening to you. Let's have a quick primer on what ADHD is.
Well, as you say, it stands for Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. The symptoms include things like restlessness, a short attention span, an inability to concentrate, and a capacity for impulsive behaviour. So it's a tricky one, and Adrian, I know you're a dad, so you might be thinking, what kid doesn't have it?
Well, I do know exactly what you mean, and I guess because all kids are prone to get fidgety or bored easily, that doctors would sometimes have difficulty in assessing ADHD.
They do, that's right. But it is important to stress that this is a medically recognised condition, and the symptoms can get really severe. One parent support group told me that a child with ADHD could, and I quote, regularly rip their clothes apart, damage furniture, punch holes in doors, render most electrical devices in the home completely useless, or set fires regularly indoors.
And this, I guess, is where the drugs come in, yeah?
That's right. It's serious stuff, and around 500,000 prescriptions are written each year for things like dexamphetamine or methylphenidate, which is better known to the world as Ritalin. Now, they've been scientifically evaluated for children with severe cases of ADHD. These drugs really do work. We've had emails in tonight already from parents telling us just how helpful they've been for their kids.
I'm sure. Now, luckily, it does sound a bit extreme to suggest, though, that some parents want their children to be given drugs just so they can claim benefits.
It does, Adrian, but I've been speaking to head teachers of primary and secondary schools in different areas of the country, and they've been telling me that some parents are, in their words, desperate to find a solution for troubled youngsters, and they think this is exactly what's happening. A diagnosis of ADHD increases your chances of getting disability living allowance and tax credits. Here's one teacher who, like the others I spoke to, spoke on condition that we didn't use their name because they didn't want to stigmatise kids in their school who do have ADHD. We've also got an actor to voice their words.
Every child that I've got on medication, we are asked to fill part of the forms that they make as benefits claimants to verify that they have ADHD. So it almost goes hand in hand.
So every single child that you have who has ADHD is from a family that's also using that to claim disability living allowance?
Yes. I think parents are very well aware of how the system works in terms of obtaining the drugs for their children and the monetary gains that they get through a diagnosis, and in some cases may well use that to obtain it.
So even when they go and visit a psychiatrist, you think that they know what they're doing?
They know what they're doing. I've got to say yes.
And Mukul, I know you've spoken to a number of teachers and medical professionals making the same claims. We've had a lot of reaction as well throughout the day to our article about this subject on the BBC News website. Even more people have contacted us through that to say this is going on.
That's right. We've had a lot of emails today Fred in Warwickshire wrote to us, I currently work within a busy frontline welfare benefit service, and more children are being awarded disability living allowance as they're supposed to have ADHD. He's been working within welfare benefits for 13 years, and people have worked out that if their child can get DLA, they can claim carer's allowance and therefore remain on income support. So thumbs up, says Fred, for bringing this to public attention. Evelyn wrote in and she says, I work with families and agree entirely with the fact that many parents seek diagnosis in order to claim both disability living allowance and carer's allowance also. I used to work as part of a specialist ADHD team in child and adolescent mental health services, and I've witnessed this on numerous occasions. And also, on top of those two, Dee and Tayside have said, I have worked with children with ADHD. On several occasions, I've been asked and refused to complete disability living allowance forms exaggerating disabilities to increase financial income, which resulted in one parent giving an abusive phone call and withdrawing his child from school for some days. But Dee also says, please remember that there are parents who truly rely on these benefits to provide extra care for their severely disabled children and their families as well.
Well, what sort of money can he get?
Now, having a diagnosis doesn't guarantee that your claim for DLA will be successful, but if it is, you can get up to £130 a week plus tax credits. I'm told that for most parents with an ADHD child, the average is nearer £40 a week.
But still clearly well worth having. What is that money actually for?
It's for help with and support for a child with this condition. For example, taxis to go to hospital appointments, or to compensate you for the fact that you might be up all night with this child and you might not be able to work as a consequence. The downside, though, is that it provides an incentive in the system to get your children diagnosed with ADHD. And according to the heads I spoke to, that can lead to children taking drugs who don't need them. Again, this is read by an actress.
Some parents will exaggerate what exactly is happening at home, particularly in terms of aggressive behaviour, violent behaviour, breaking up furniture and so on, in order to get a care allowance, maybe a 24-hour care allowance. And they will come into school and insist that their behaviour in school is inappropriate when perhaps we don't think it is. See, I think we've got a system for young people who are diagnosed with ADHD which gives them and their parents access to medication and to additional funding to help them in their home. And that's benefits, and that works. However, I think in the absence of any other kind of therapeutic support or any other diagnosis or a greater understanding of what's going on out there, I think there are students on the edge of that who may have behavioural difficulties, who are very quickly being diagnosed, caught up in the entire system for students with ADHD. And they're ending up on medication and ending up in a system which actually they should never have been in.
So that is a very disturbing and powerful piece of evidence, Muckle. What does the government have to say about all this?
Well, we spoke to the Department for Work and Pensions. They say they're consulting on reform, and they admit that it's not right that a benefit set up to improve lives could be having the opposite impact. OK, well,
let's get a word with Dave Traxon. Dave is a senior educational psychologist from the West Midlands who believes that these drugs are sometimes misprescribed, and Professor Chris Hollis of Nottingham University and Queen's Medical Centre, a practising child psychiatrist who helped to draft the current NICE guidelines. Good evening to you, Professor Hollis. How are you?
Good evening, Adrian.
Yeah, what are the dangers of children taking drugs to treat ADHD who don't actually have the condition?
Well, I think we need to put this into context, because the evidence actually that the condition is overdiagnosed and children are inappropriately receiving the medication is really very thin indeed. In fact,
Well, I have to say it's quite powerful, both from the head teachers that we've spoken to in the preparation of this programme, and indeed I have to say from the vast number of texts and emails that we've received to the programme today supporting our story.
Right. I'm really drawing on evidence of large-scale research studies carried out over the last 5 years in the UK, looking at the diagnosis and the accuracy of diagnosis of ADHD, which is when the NICE guidelines are applied and diagnosis is made carefully and systematically, particularly including input from teachers and schools into that process, then it's extremely accurate. And the issue is perhaps more one of underdiagnosis than overdiagnosis.
Well, you're
currently
talking
in the UK.
about research, long-term study. I mean, this could just be the latest scam that people have got word of. I noticed that in just 2 years, between 2007 and 2009, the number of prescriptions for 16 to 18-year-olds for these kind of drugs, for that group alone, rose by 51%. How do you account for that?
Well, the issue there, Adrian, is that not majority of those young people had a diagnosis, but were either dropping out of treatment or were not being treated. The recognition of ADHD persisting into young adult life has really only been made in the last 5 to 10 years. And these
Muckle's got a point here. Go on, Muckle.
Professor Hollis, could it be that what might be happening is that because of the lack of communication between teachers and because of the way the system is, the wrong people are being diagnosed, that some people may not be being diagnosed, but yet the wrong people may be being diagnosed?
Well, this is certainly a possibility, but I can only draw on the evidence that we have rather than just a few anecdotal reports.
Yeah, well, I'd like you to reflect on the
that I think
the evidence that we have, Professor Hollis. We'll come back to you in a moment, and we'll talk about those nice guidelines that you've mentioned. I want to bring in Dave Traxton, who, as I say, is a senior educational psychologist in the West Midlands. Dave, from the evidence that we have, it seems that parents are desperate to get their children, in some cases, diagnosed as ADHD.
Well, I'm certainly reassured by the responses you've had to your programme, and that fits nicely with the information I get from colleagues all over the West Midlands. And those colleagues are psychologists, head teachers, social workers, and that fits very nicely with that picture. And one of the problems with Dr. Hollis's argument is the point about triangulation of data, that there are 3 sides to a triangle: the doctor, the parent and the school. And in over half the cases, we reckon, in the West Midlands, when we do surveys on this, the school is not contacted, so they do not have a checklist to fill in. So Professor Stephen Rose, the eminent professor, argues that these assessments are too reliant on one side, which is the parent information.
Well, we'll come back to that very shortly. I think you're making a very important point there, Dave. But are you saying then that the evidence that we've compiled suggesting that parents are keen sometimes to get their children prescribed very powerful drugs in order to claim benefits, in your view, that is justified?
I mean, I don't want to get into the blame game for parents, because there are some very disadvantaged parents that claim benefits, and sometimes they are very correctly provided. When I do straw polls with my colleagues around the West Midlands, the figure that we come up with consistently is that in about 20% of the prescriptions, we accept that those are valid and accurate diagnoses of ADHD, because they've used all 3 sides of the data. But in the other 80%, a lot of my colleagues all over the country, not just the West Midlands, because I've spoken at 2 national conferences recently, colleagues all over the country have major concerns about the appropriateness, especially in relation to the use of some very questionable checklists.
OK, well, we'll get Professor Hollis to comment on that before too long. Dave Traxton and Professor Hollis, thank you both very much indeed. And of course, here on 5 Live Investigates, as always, we're keen to hear about your experiences of ADHD. Are doctors too willing to prescribe mood-altering drugs to children? Or are parents who try to help their offspring being unfairly stigmatised? Drop us a text to 85058 or email goldberg@bbc.co.uk. Alternatively, leave a comment via Facebook or Twitter. Just search for 5 Live Investigates.
International football this week on 5 Live and 5 Live Sports Extra. On Tuesday night in 5 Live Sport from 7, the opening match in the Nations Cup. The Republic of Ireland play Wales.
Oh my word! What a stunning goal!
On Wednesday, commentary of England's friendly away to Denmark. Kick-off 7:15. And over on 5 Live Sports Extra, more Nations Cup football. Northern Ireland face Scotland. Kick-off 7:45. To find out how to listen to 5 Live Sports Extra, click bbc.co.uk/5live.
5 Live investigates
With Adrian Goldberg.
Tonight on 5 Live Investigates, claims that youngsters who are simply badly behaved are being diagnosed with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD, and being put on powerful stimulant drugs. Many children with the complaint do benefit from treatments like Ritalin, but we're hearing allegations on the show from 2 head teachers who say that some parents push doctors into giving medication even when it's not suitable, sometimes to help them get benefits. There have also been claims that doctors are too willing to do a tick box examination of the children instead of checking properly with the school whether their behaviour can be properly classed as ADHD. Your responses have been coming in, and our reporter Mukul Devachand has been sifting through the texts and emails, as well as your tweets and your Facebook responses, and there have, Mukul, been loads.
There have. There's been an epic response, really, Adrian. One woman in London, we won't use her name, she says, "Unfortunately, I have to agree with these suspicions. I have a family member with 2 children who've been diagnosed with a myriad of disorders, including ADHD. As far as I and other family members can see, there's nothing wrong with these children. They behave perfectly normally around us, but where the mother is claiming every benefit available to her because of this diagnosis." P says, "I know personally of a mother who wants to play the system to claim extra benefits. She would feed her primary school aged son chocolate, sweets and fizzy drinks before assessments to create hyperactive, distorted behaviour." I don't know if that would get past the doctors, but...
No, well, Peter says, "I'm a sufferer of ADHD, and what these head teachers have to say on the matter is completely insulting to people such as me. These head teachers have no medical or psychological training, and yet they see fit to judge if a person is lying about a severe condition." An anonymous emailer says, "My son was diagnosed with ADHD by a psychiatrist. He now takes medication but has been refused disability living allowance because he is, quotes, of above average intelligence, despite his behaviour at home being destructive and violent. I do not doubt that what the head teachers say is true, though. I am also a teacher and know of one child in receipt of benefits who sold his Ritalin for even more money, but the blame lies with the government as well as the parents." And Muckley, I'm intrigued. Yeah, where are the doctors in all this? I mean, even if parents are pushy, surely it's the doctors who have the final say.
Of course they do, Adrian. But there's evidence that in some cases, doctors aren't quite following the recommendations in the clinical guidelines that Professor Chris Hollis mentioned earlier. According to those guidelines, doctors are supposed to check whether a child displays symptoms of ADHD in more than one setting. So perhaps not just at home with the parents, but in the school as well. The head teacher of one primary school I spoke to said 2 or 3 children each year in her school are now medicated without doctors checking the kids' behaviour with the teachers first.
Parents will go to their GPs, who then refer them on to a paediatrician. They will have any time from 20 minutes to an hour with the paediatrician to tell them all about what their child is doing at home, and then a drug is prescribed with no consultation with the schools. So we just feel that the paediatrician is not getting a full picture of that child in all its settings.
Do paediatricians check with you before prescribing these drugs?
Not in every case, no. I worked with another authority where it worked very well. The doctors would ask teachers to monitor a child in class, whether they showed signs of settling down, whether concentration was poor, whether social interaction had improved, whether their diet had changed, and whether they'd become more lethargic. And then there was a meeting to discuss with the parent whether the drug that was being used was the right one for the child. But this hasn't been the case with the doctors in this authority. So no, we don't have any correspondence. We have to chase it up with the paediatricians here.
So in a sense, she's backing up what Dave Traxon said to us earlier on, that some authorities and doctors don't do the proper checks.
Yes, that's right. But to be clear, she's saying that it varies from area to area and also from doctor to doctor. I've been told that some doctors do check as well, but they just send a general form for teachers to fill out, which is the same for ADHD or other behavioural disorders as it is for physical conditions like asthma.
Why is it so important to check what goes on at school?
The risk is that, number one, if they don't check, they don't see it in different contexts, it might not actually be ADHD. And of course, as well, the risk is that some families who are very keen to get an ADHD diagnosis could use the fact they're not checking to play the system.
So like filling their kids up with fizzy drinks, as one emailer suggested before the diagnosis test.
Exactly. Well, the head of one primary school I spoke to told me about a 10-year-old whose parents lied to a paediatrician to get his dosage of ADHD drugs increased. The parents mentioned to the doctor lots of incidences that had supposedly happened in the school, whereas in fact the child hadn't even been coming into school for 3 months.
Wow.
The paediatrician sent an email to the child's GP, but copied in the school by mistake.
Basically, we had got a letter from a paediatrician who had not seen the child before. And bearing in mind that we had had him for 3 years, but the doctor had never even bothered to ring our school to find out if any of this was true. So we did write a letter back and spoke to the paediatrician to explain that the child hadn't actually been in school for 12 weeks.
So the parents had basically been telling fibs to the paediatrician?
Yes, to get the medication higher. They wanted more medication, so had exaggerated his behaviour.
So why do you think the paediatrician had not checked?
I've no idea. Because we weren't even supposed to see this letter. It had gone to the child's GP. We had been copied in by mistake.
So, because of that happy accident, I suppose, that one case was at least able to be rechecked. Goodness knows how many other cases there are out there which schools are simply unaware of.
But this case does have a happy ending after all that. The school contacted the doctor, who re-examined the child and determined that he didn't have ADHD at all, but rather had extreme anxiety. Wow. The child's medication's now been stopped altogether.
OK, Muckle, we'll come back to you for some more responses later. We've also got a guest with us, Professor Chris Hollis from Nottingham University and Queen's Medical Centre, a practising child psychologist as well, and Dave Traxton, a senior educational psychologist from the West Midlands. Professor Hollis, I want to pick up on some of the points made by the teachers, and the one that Dave Traxton made a little bit earlier. He claims that 80% of these tests, of these diagnoses, are not made in accordance with the guidelines which you, as a member of NICE, drew up.
Well, that's very concerning, and I would agree entirely with Dave that this is if this is the data he's getting from the West Midlands, it is very concerning, because, as I said, what we know is that if clinicians follow the guidelines, then diagnosis is accurate, and it is essential that it should involve teachers and they're part of that process. But clearly there is variation, and that's concerning. And often the issue is the implementation of guidance.
Well, quite. And is there anything in the system, once you've set your guidelines, to ensure that they are properly followed?
Well, I think there are a number of processes. There are audits and governance procedures within trust. There is also the new government's outcome framework, and there are the slight concerns, I think. Certainly I have concerns that what they're setting forward are care standards for various conditions, up to 150 conditions, and at the moment ADHD isn't one of those conditions. So I think there is a real onus, if we're going to take this seriously and implement guidelines to improve care for children and families, then we do need to ensure that government and that commissioning authorities, etc., are checking that these guidelines are being followed.
Yeah, pretty urgently by the sound of it, on the evidence I think we've got tonight. Let's get a word again with Dave Traxton. And Dave, I got this email from Stephen in Nottingham. He says, I have a child with ADHD. I've encountered a severe lack of knowledge in both the medical and educational professions about the condition. Educators, more often than not, think of it as bad parent syndrome, largely because they are so poorly educated about special educational needs during teacher training. Anything to that?
I mean, I don't want to get into blaming parents, as I said earlier. I'd rather pursue Chris's candour, really, about his concern. And I respect the work that Chris did on producing the NICE guidelines, but just to add alarm to what we've already got, I'd like to share the 3 most common breaches of the NICE guideline that happen in the West Midlands. And we're not talking about 10 cases, we're talking about hundreds of cases. The first is that it's given to children under the age of 6. And let's just remember, these are amphetamines, street name speed.
Well, they're not strictly amphetamines, are they?
No,
they do
are.
bear a chemical resemblance to amphetamine.
No, they are amphetamines. They are amphetamines.
Well, we'll get Professor Hollis to come back on that in a moment.
If I can just repeat the other 2 breaches, which I think Chris Hollis would be concerned about.
Yeah.
that they regularly do not monitor the weight of the children at 6 monthly intervals. And when a group of psychiatrists were asked about that, they said, we haven't got the manpower to do it. And one of their colleagues sort of implied, well, if they haven't got the manpower to do it, we perhaps shouldn't be giving so many prescriptions. And then the final breach, which I think is very concerning, is the regularity with which amphetamines, which are stimulants, that's the word that doctors prefer to use because it's a bit quieter, are given to children with anxiety conditions. And we all know that when we're anxious personally, the last thing that you would have is a stimulant.
OK, well, Professor Hollis, firstly, is this amphetamine, and do you accept that children under the age of 6 are being improperly prescribed these drugs for ADHD?
Well, we were very clear in the guidelines that these drugs, the stimulants, the central nervous system stimulants, that includes methylphenidate, as you said, commonly known as Ritalin, dexamphetamine, should not be used for children under the age of 6 because there's no evidence and that the risks outweigh the benefits. We're also clear that they shouldn't be used as a first-line treatment in more moderate ADHD, and that's where behavioural support and psychological intervention should be used as a primary treatment.
I mean, having heard what you've heard tonight and the evidence brought forward on the show by Dave Traxon, are you willing, as a member of NICE, as somebody who issued the guidelines, to instigate any kind of review or investigation into this situation?
Well, I think it's an important issue that all commissioning PCTs and the trust that doctors work should be reviewing how guidelines are being implemented. But I would say that the key message, though, is that we mustn't, and I agree with Dave again, not stigmatise the vast majority of parents who and young people who have really severe difficulties and impairment, and
well,
are actually struggling.
I think, in fairness, Professor Hollis, we have reflected that in the programme. We're talking about the cases where there is misdiagnosis and misprescription. We're getting texts and emails from paediatricians who are telling us that this is a real problem. What is going to be done about it?
Well, I think there's a range of issues, and I'm in a sense that saying as well to the, I mentioned the government's outcome framework. If we're going to be serious about improving outcomes in healthcare and reducing variations, then conditions which have been somewhat at the margins, like ADHD, have to be taken seriously in terms of resourcing and in terms of commissioning. Because if this was happening to diabetes or heart disease, there would be an absolute uproar.
5 Live investigates.
To our story about the overprescription or misprescription of drugs like Ritalin for children diagnosed with ADHD. And Muckle, you've got plenty of responses there.
Loads of responses. I've got an email from Cheshire, no name on this. We know of parents who give their children energy drinks before doctor or hospital appointments to make them believe the child has ADHD. So
we've had more than one saying that, haven't we? Yeah.
People pumping their children full of sugar.
Amazing.
Richard in Northampton says, my son was eventually diagnosed with ADHD after referral by a GP to a specialist. And the whole process took a year before he was prescribed Ritalin. This enabled him to live a normal life, to make friends for the first time, to achieve good GCSEs. The real story, according to Richard, is the large number of undiagnosed cases, which often leads to children being suspended or expelled from school with consequent effects on the rest of their lives. So a reminder that the drugs do work for many.
Absolutely. And also, Richard, they're echoing the point made by Professor Chris Hollis, that as well as some children being diagnosed with ADHD when they don't have the condition, there may be many other children out there who do have it who aren't being diagnosed. Tony in Yorkshire says, before I retired as a GP a year ago, I did disability living allowance medicals, which included quite a few unreported ADHD children. The parents would give a classical history of ADHD with the child there. Most of the time, the child would just sit quietly through the interview, showing no signs at all of hyperactivity.